For over 4 centuries, one question has whispered through the corridors of English history. Why did Queen Elizabeth I, the most powerful woman of her age, die alone, untouched, and unwed? They called her the Virgin Queen, a title carved into history like a halo, radiant, sacred, unblemished. But what if that virgin crown was not a symbol of purity, but of fear? Behind the painted perfection, Elizabeth Tudor hid a secret so deeply buried that even her most loyal subjects never dared to speak of it. Courtiers spread rumors in silence. Foreign ambassadors sent cryptic letters to their kings. And the Queen herself, surrounded by beauty, power, and worship, kept one terrifying truth locked behind her smile. She claimed to be married to England, but that vow was not made from love. It was made from something darker. The daughter of an executed mother, the child of a tyrant king, a girl who grew up in a palace of ghosts, watching blood spill faster than ink. And in that haunted childhood, something happened. Something that twisted her idea of love forever. The court called her divine. History called her brilliant, but what history never told you is that Elizabeth's vow of virginity may have been born not out of holiness, but out of horror, a secret sealed in silence for nearly 400 years. Because sometimes, the brightest crown hides the darkest wound, and tonight, we're going to uncover the sickening reason the Virgin Queen never married. When Elizabeth Tudor ascended the throne in 1558, England was broken, torn apart by religion, rebellion, and rot. Her father, Henry VIII, had split the church. Her sister, Mary, had drowned the nation in blood trying to restore it. And when the crown finally landed on Elizabeth's head, it wasn't just gold she inherited. It was chaos. She was 25. Young, unmarried, and surrounded by men who believed a woman could not rule alone. They whispered that she needed a husband, a king beside her, to give England legitimacy. But Elizabeth saw something they didn't. She understood that the moment she married, she would lose everything: her throne, her freedom, and maybe her life. Every suitor brought danger. A marriage to a foreign prince would make England a pawn in Europe's endless wars. A marriage to an English noble would split the court into rival factions. And deep down, Elizabeth knew men didn't want a partner. They wanted a crown. So she crafted something extraordinary. She built a myth around herself. Not a queen in need of a husband, but a queen beyond the need for one. Elizabeth reinvented herself as something half human, half divine. She was no longer just a woman. She became the Virgin Queen. Her image was carefully engineered. Her pale skin symbolized purity. Her jewels shimmered like celestial stars, and her hair, a blazing halo of red gold, was the light of heaven itself. Artists painted her like the Virgin Mary. Poets wrote of her as a goddess untouchable by sin. Courtiers bowed not just before their monarch, but before a living idol. It was political genius, a divine deception. But behind that image, there was a woman. One who knew the cost of her own invention. Because the more she claimed purity, the more she became trapped by it. Every rumor, every whisper about her private life became treason. Every smile toward a man became scandal. She lived under constant watch. Even her ladies-in-waiting were forbidden to marry without permission. The queen who ruled everyone trusted no one. Foreign ambassadors called her cold. Some said she was incapable of love. But her closest servants saw something else, a flicker of fear behind her eyes whenever marriage was mentioned. When pressed to choose a husband, she would laugh and say, "I will have but one mistress here and no master." Her laughter masked something darker. You see, Elizabeth's so-called cult of virginity wasn't just strategy. It was armor. An emotional fortress she built brick by brick, hiding behind symbols of holiness to protect something she could never speak of. Pain, shame, and memories she wished would burn away. Because while the world worshipped her purity, only she knew the truth behind it. Her father had killed her mother for betrayal. Her childhood was a masterclass in fear and deceit. Love in Elizabeth's world was never gentle, it was always fatal. So she turned that fear into faith, that trauma into power, and that loneliness into legend. When she placed the crown upon her head, she declared before the world, "I am married to England." The people cheered, believing they had gained a saint. But what they didn't see was that England had just become her shield, a barrier between her heart and every man who might ever try to touch it again. Elizabeth wasn't just a virgin by choice, she was a virgin by survival. And the story of why begins long before she ever became queen. Before she was the Virgin Queen, before the jeweled crown and divine portraits, Elizabeth Tudor was a child surrounded by death. Born in 1533, she entered a world already bleeding. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was the second wife of Henry VIII, the king who changed his country's faith just to marry her. But passion in Tudor England burned fast and ended violently. When Elizabeth was barely 3 years old, she was led away from her mother's chambers. Days later, Anne Boleyn's head rolled onto the Tower Green. The same father who once called his daughter a glorious gift from heaven now declared her a bastard. Her household was dismantled, her title stripped, her name erased from royal documents. She was no longer Princess Elizabeth. She was simply Lady Elizabeth, the unwanted child of a condemned queen. In those early years, Elizabeth learned one rule, that love in her world could vanish overnight. Every figure she trusted would eventually betray her, leave her, or die. Her childhood became a silent education in fear. When Elizabeth was 14, her father was long dead. The throne had passed to her younger half-brother, Edward VI. Elizabeth lived quietly under the care of her stepmother, the widowed Queen Catherine Parr. It should have been a time of peace, but instead, it became the beginning of her deepest scars. Catherine had remarried. Her new husband was Thomas Seymour, the king's uncle, tall, handsome, reckless, and dangerously ambitious. At first, Elizabeth admired him. Everyone did. He was charming, bold, and spoke to her with a warmth few ever had. But soon, that warmth turned into something else. Servants began to notice strange things. Thomas Seymour visiting Elizabeth's bedchamber before dawn. Laughter echoing down the corridor, followed by nervous silence. Sometimes he would tickle her while she was still in bed. Other times, he'd slap her on the backside and call it play. One morning, he came in while she was still in her nightgown. When Catherine Parr caught them, she didn't laugh. She screamed. But even after that, Catherine sometimes joined in the games, trying to make light of them, though her face was pale with shame. Elizabeth was only 14. She didn't understand the danger she was in, but she could feel it. The air around Seymour carried a poison she couldn't name. Soon the Queen grew uneasy. Elizabeth was sent away to a distant estate, supposedly for her education. But the truth was whispered among servants. Catherine Parr feared what was happening between her husband and her stepdaughter. Months later, the Queen died during childbirth. And Thomas Seymour, freed from restraint, began plotting to marry Elizabeth himself. He wrote her letters, made promises, tried to lure her into his schemes to seize the crown. But his ambition cost him everything. He was arrested for treason, accused of plotting to kidnap the young King Edward. During his interrogation, Elizabeth's name surfaced again and again. The council questioned her mercilessly. Was she involved? Had Seymour seduced her? Was she still pure? Elizabeth was terrified, but she never confessed to anything. She denied knowing his intentions, denied impropriety, and held her ground with the icy composure that would define her reign. But inside, she was breaking. When Seymour was executed, Elizabeth locked herself in her chamber and wept for hours. Not just for him, but for what he had taken from her. Her trust, her innocence, her ability to ever see affection without suspicion. From that moment, something inside her changed. Her tutors wrote that she became grave and silent. Her laughter faded. She withdrew into her books, her studies, her masks. The brilliant, cautious, untouchable woman she became was forged in that fire. The child who once dreamed of love had learned that love was a weapon, and she would never let it be used against her again. Thomas Seymour's name was erased from official histories, but his shadow never left her. Historians still argue what truly happened between them, whether it was seduction, coercion, or something far darker. But whatever it was, it left a scar so deep that even a crown couldn't hide it. Elizabeth would never marry, not out of purity, but out of protection. "I shall never marry," she once told her council, "for I have seen too many examples of marriage bringing sorrow." Her words weren't politics, they were confession. By the time Thomas Seymour's head fell beneath the executioner's axe, Elizabeth Tudor was only 15. But already, her name was stained by whispers that would follow her for life. She had survived the scandal, but not the shadow it left behind. Because in Tudor England, a woman's purity was her power. And once it was questioned, it was never forgotten. After Seymour's execution, rumors spread like wildfire through the court. Servants who had once worked in Catherine Parr's household told stories of laughter too loud, of embraces too long, of games that didn't sound so innocent. Foreign ambassadors wrote back to their kings describing improper familiarity between the princess and her guardian. The Spanish envoy recorded that Elizabeth was a girl of proud wit and dangerous experience. Others whispered she had already been spoiled. No proof ever surfaced, but the damage was done. To the nobles, she was no longer the innocent child of the realm. To the church, she was already a cautionary tale. In every glance from the courtiers, she could feel it, that unspoken question, that cruel, invisible accusation. Had she been defiled? For the rest of her life, Elizabeth would carry the burden of that question. She never admitted what truly happened with Thomas Seymour, not even to her closest confidants. But her later words, her strange habits, her deep mistrust of men, all revealed a truth she couldn't speak. "I have no desire for that which many desire. I am content as I am, and I will never put my liberty into the hands of another." To most, it sounded like the statement of a proud monarch. But between the lines, you can feel the ache of a woman who had learned that love and danger often shared the same face. After Seymour's death, Elizabeth became coldly disciplined. She began guarding every gesture, every word, every expression. Her tutors wrote that she grew too wise for her years, too cautious to be loved. And perhaps that was the only way she could survive, because the scandal had changed her reputation forever. Even years later, when she was queen, some nobles still remembered that story and used it against her in secret. Ambassadors described her as proud, vain, and chaste in name only. Enemies spread rumors that she had borne Seymour's child in secret, that the baby was hidden or killed. It was a lie, but it found a willing audience in a world eager to see powerful women brought low. The more they questioned her virtue, the more she clung to it. Her virginity became not just her reputation, but her redemption. She turned the shame that once haunted her into the very myth that would define her reign. If the world saw her as impure, she would rise above it by becoming untouchable. To the court, she became a riddle wrapped in light. She flirted boldly, laughed at suitors, and toyed with kings, but always stopped just short of letting anyone close enough to touch her. It was as if she lived her entire life with a wall of glass between her and the world. Robert Dudley, the man she loved most, would later write, "She could give her heart, but never her body." He understood what most didn't, that Elizabeth's celibacy wasn't the absence of desire, it was the fear of being consumed by it again. Each night she slept alone, no husband, no heir, only the memories that refused to die. When courtiers pressed her to marry, she would snap, "If I follow the counsel of men, I shall end as my mother did." She didn't need to explain what that meant. Everyone remembered what had happened to Anne Boleyn. Loved, betrayed, beheaded. To Elizabeth, marriage meant surrender, and surrender meant death. So she forged her own weapon, chastity. Her body became a fortress, her purity, a crown sharper than any blade. She began to embody the image of a woman who could never be possessed, not by any man, not even by the idea of love itself. It was both her greatest victory and her deepest wound. Because while the world called her the Virgin Queen, in truth, that virginity was never a choice. It was a scar, gilded in gold. Elizabeth buried her pain beneath layers of silk and ceremony. She ruled her kingdom with fire and brilliance. But no matter how powerful she became, the ghost of that scandal never left her. Behind every smile, behind every speech, behind every rejection of marriage, was the frightened girl who once learned that love could destroy. By the time Elizabeth Tudor became queen in 1558, she was no longer the frightened child of scandal. She was England's last hope. But the ghosts of her past didn't fade with her coronation. They followed her into every meeting, every council, every proposal of marriage, and soon they became her most dangerous weapon. From the moment she took the throne, men tried to control her. Her council urged her to marry. Foreign princes sent lavish gifts. Ambassadors wrote letters dripping with flattery. They all saw a young queen who could be conquered, a pawn to be married off for power. But Elizabeth saw something else. She saw a board, and herself, the only queen who knew how to play the game. To them, she was a woman who refused to yield, but that was exactly her strategy. She knew marriage would end her reign before it began. If she chose a foreign husband, England would fall under another nation's influence. If she married an English noble, the court would devour itself in jealousy. So she made her celibacy her shield and her sword. Elizabeth would entertain suitors, flirt with them, even promise engagement. But at the last moment, she would withdraw. She turned diplomacy into seduction, and seduction into politics. She could charm a man into loyalty or confusion. Her refusal to commit made her both desired and feared. The French called her La Reine Coquette. The Spanish ambassador called her a woman who plays with men as a cat plays with mice. They were right. But they didn't understand that behind every act of manipulation was a woman still terrified of being trapped. She once said, "I do not desire to make windows into men's souls." Yet she could see through every one of them. She'd grown up in a world of lies, betrayal, and hunger for power. Now she used those very weapons to keep herself alive. The Virgin Queen was not born of purity. She was born of politics and paranoia. But even the strongest armor weighs heavy. As the years passed, Elizabeth's performance became her prison. Her image, the untouchable divine queen, could never slip. She had to be perfect, eternal, ageless. She forbade her ladies-in-waiting from marrying without her consent, not because of cruelty, but because every marriage reminded her of the fate she had chosen to escape. Love, in her court, became a forbidden act. She surrounded herself with beauty, but not affection. She ruled with charm, but not warmth. The queen's heart was a weapon, polished, sharp, and never used. And yet, there were cracks in the armor. Her bond with Robert Dudley was the most dangerous of all. He was her childhood friend, her confidant, her shadow. When his wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead under mysterious circumstances, the court erupted in scandal. Some whispered that Elizabeth had orchestrated it. Others believed it was an accident. But for Elizabeth, it didn't matter. The tragedy destroyed whatever chance of love she had left. She would never marry Dudley, not out of duty, but out of fear. Fear of what love could cost. Fear of losing everything. Again. Every man who came to court her, the Duke of Anjou, the Archduke Charles, the King of Sweden, found himself caught in the same invisible web. Promises dangled, hopes lifted. Then, silence. Elizabeth's heart was the ultimate political illusion. The more she seemed attainable, the more power she held. And yet, with every deception, her isolation deepened. Power had protected her, but it also poisoned her. As the years dragged on, she became addicted to her own myth, the radiant, eternal virgin whose purity kept England safe. But the truth beneath the paint was fragile. Her skin was scarred from cosmetics, her teeth blackened from decay, her heart hollow from decades of control. In public, she was unbreakable. In private, she was haunted. Her childhood trauma had become the foundation of her throne. Every refusal, every diplomatic maneuver, every flirtation, all built upon that unspoken fear that love would destroy her as it destroyed everyone she'd ever known. To the world, Elizabeth's virginity was a symbol of divine power. To her, it was a wall she could never climb out of. Her reign became one long performance, a masterpiece of control. But even queens cannot rule over their own ghosts, and behind the glitter of empire, behind the silken veil of history, Elizabeth I remained what she had always been, a woman hiding her fear beneath a crown. For a woman who called herself the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth Tudor was surrounded by men who longed to be the one exception. Kings, dukes, princes, and poets all believed they could melt the heart beneath the crown, but only one man ever came close, and his name was Robert Dudley. He was everything she was not allowed to love: bold, reckless, a man with charm that could turn danger into temptation. They had known each other since childhood, their lives twisted together by fate and scandal. Both had seen their fathers executed for treason. Both had learned early that love could be fatal. Perhaps that was what bound them. Two survivors drawn to the only person who understood the price of power. He called her my sweet Robin. She called him Eyes. They shared everything: letters, secrets, even laughter in the shadows of court life. But their closeness was dangerous, too visible, too intimate. Ambassadors began to whisper that the Queen's chambers were never truly empty, that her virginity was only a mask. And then, one morning, a scream shattered the illusion. On September 8, 1560, Robert Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase, her neck broken. Officially, it was called an accident, but no one believed it. Some said Dudley had her killed to free himself for the Queen. Others whispered Elizabeth ordered it herself. For weeks, the court was thick with suspicion, and though no proof was ever found, the scandal burned her reputation like acid. The Virgin Queen could never risk such whispers again. She didn't visit Amy's funeral. She didn't speak Dudley's name in public. But in private, she wept. And when Dudley returned to court, she didn't banish him. She promoted him. She gave him wealth, titles, favor, everything except her hand in marriage. It was the cruelest kind of love, constant but incomplete. He remained at her side for decades, a symbol of what she could never allow herself to have. They said their chemistry could set the court on fire, and it did. When Dudley remarried years later, Elizabeth erupted in fury. She locked herself in her chamber for days, refusing to eat, breaking mirrors in rage. To the world, it looked like royal pride, but it wasn't. It was heartbreak. She had built her throne on self-control, and for a moment that control shattered. Yet Elizabeth wasn't only haunted by love lost, she was tormented by love forbidden. Throughout her reign, suitors lined up like offerings at an altar: the Archduke Charles of Austria, the Duke of Anjou, King Eric of Sweden. Each one dangled the promise of alliance, stability, and heirs. But none of them truly wanted Elizabeth. They wanted England, and she knew it. So she danced her game again: letters, gifts, flattery, and then withdrawal. She was never cruel, only clever. Always leaving them guessing, never giving them closure. Her virginity wasn't weakness, it was diplomacy. The Duke of Anjou, her frog, as she affectionately called him, nearly broke the pattern. He was younger, impulsive, and genuinely seemed to adore her. For the first time in decades, she seemed ready to risk it. But the English people loathed the idea of a foreign husband. They rioted in the streets, burned effigies, shouted, "Death to the Frenchman!" Elizabeth watched her own country turn on her for daring to feel again. So she ended it, coldly. When he left England, she stood at her window, watching his ship disappear into the fog. Tears streaked the paint on her face. And then, as always, she turned her sorrow into strength. Over time, Elizabeth's heart became like her kingdom, fortified, powerful, and walled in stone. She ruled through charm and illusion, but she lived in solitude. She kept Dudley close until the end. When he died in 1588, she found his last letter and locked it in a box beside her bed. She labeled it simply, his last letter. When she died 20 years later, that same letter was still there, worn, creased, and kissed by time. Elizabeth loved deeply, but never safely. She could command nations, outwit kings, and shape empires, but she could never master her own heart. Every man she might have loved was either forbidden, married, or dangerous. And every choice she made to protect herself came at the cost of connection. Her throne gave her everything, except the one thing she secretly longed for, to be loved, not as a queen, but as a woman. History remembers her as the Virgin Queen. But behind that sacred title was a story of longing, betrayal, and sacrifice. Because the woman who ruled the hearts of millions could never truly give away her own. By the end of her life, Queen Elizabeth I had become an icon, flawless, untouchable, eternal. But behind the mask of white powder and crimson lips, her body was collapsing under the weight of time, fear, and something no physician could cure. They called her the Virgin Queen. But her purity was not divine. It was perhaps the side effect of something darker, a sickness that haunted her flesh and her mind. The records of Elizabeth's final years speak in riddles. Her health failed suddenly, then recovered, only to fail again. Her skin became mottled. Her hair, once fiery red, thinned to wisps of silver. And then came the worst part. Her face began to decay beneath the very paint she used to hide it. The thick white mask she wore, the Venetian ceruse, was made from lead. Each day she painted poison onto her skin, and each day it seeped deeper into her blood. Lead poisoning eats the body slowly. It causes tremors, memory loss, madness. Some historians believe Elizabeth's paranoia, her violent temper, and even her strange refusal to eat were symptoms of that silent toxin. She was literally killing herself in the name of beauty. Her mask, that white, perfect royal face, was both her armor and her executioner. And beneath that paint, her skin blistered, scarred, and rotted. The Queen of England, ruler of empires, conqueror of nations, was rotting alive. And yet, she never stopped smiling, never removed the mask. She couldn't, because the Virgin Queen was not allowed to be human. By her final decade, Elizabeth's behavior had changed. She refused to sleep in a bed, fearing death would find her there. She stood for hours, muttering prayers under her breath, then would suddenly burst into tears. Her counselors whispered she was not herself. But how could she be? The woman who had once ruled through control, through the illusion of perfection, was watching that perfection dissolve in her own mirror. Every morning she ordered her maids to light more candles, to hang more mirrors, to brighten the room, as if she could chase away the shadows growing inside her. And yet, one shadow always followed. The rumor of an illness, one she had carried her entire life. Foreign ambassadors described her as ill-shaped, marked by scars, and in fear of physicians. There were whispers of strange pains, of swelling, bleeding, and secret treatments. Even her closest ladies-in-waiting noticed the bandages she sometimes wore beneath her gowns. One French observer claimed she had a growth in her body which forbids her the company of men. Could it be true? Some believe Elizabeth suffered from a rare gynecological disorder, a malformed womb, an ovarian cyst, or a disease that made intimacy impossible. If that was true, then her virginity wasn't a choice. It was a curse. Imagine her, a woman groomed to marry, to produce heirs, to cement the future of her dynasty, carrying a secret that made her body betray that destiny. To her court, she claimed divine purity, but perhaps in private, she felt only shame and fear. In the 16th century, any sign of imperfection in a royal woman could destroy her throne. If her body was broken, she had to hide it behind myth. And so she became a legend, a virgin by choice, rather than a woman marked by frailty. Her chastity became her crown, her sickness, her secret. But her illness wasn't only physical, it was emotional, psychological. Years of betrayal, execution, and survival had turned her heart into a fortress. She had seen love kill her mother, seen desire destroy her father, seen marriage become a trap for every woman around her. So perhaps her body and her mind both agreed. Love was death. Desire was danger. And her sickness, real or imagined, was her last defense. By 1603, Elizabeth was 69. She was exhausted, delirious, and weak. She refused food, refused rest, and spoke of ghosts visiting her chambers. When her servants begged her to lie down, she whispered, "I shall have no mistress but death." Her doctors believed she suffered from pneumonia. Others thought it was depression, but those who looked into her eyes saw something else. A woman finally surrendering to the pain she had hidden for decades. When Elizabeth died, her body was found cold but peaceful. The paint still clung to her face. The lead still poisoned her blood, and the mystery of her virginity, her illness, her fear, died with her. History crowned her the Virgin Queen. But her legend was not born from purity. It was born from pain, sickness, and survival. She lived her life behind a mask of beauty, of strength, of control. And when that mask finally cracked, the truth that emerged was not divine, but devastating. The year was 1603. England held its breath. For 45 years, Queen Elizabeth I had ruled like a force of nature, defiant, commanding, eternal. But even the Virgin Queen could not command time. Her empire was vast, her name immortal. And yet, in her final days, she was just a woman, surrounded by ghosts. She no longer spoke in full sentences, only fragments, murmurs, whispers to the dead. Her closest attendants said she saw figures standing at the foot of her bed, a child in a white gown, a woman with blood on her dress, a man watching from the shadows. Some said it was her mind collapsing. Others said her past had finally come for her. Because when Elizabeth Tudor looked into the darkness, she saw her mother, Anne Boleyn, the woman who died so she could live. The child who once watched her mother be erased by her father's cruelty had spent her life trying to prove she was nothing like either of them. But now, as the fire in her body dimmed, she could feel both their ghosts within her: Henry's temper, Anne's pride, and the loneliness of a throne that had given her everything, except peace. Her servants begged her to lie down. She only shook her head. "If I rest," she whispered, "I may never rise again." For days she remained like that, motionless, draped in heavy robes, refusing food, refusing prayer. They said she stared into the shadows for hours, as if listening to someone who wasn't there. When her archbishop entered and asked what troubled her, she simply said, "My spirit will not let me rest." By now, her courtiers knew the end was near. The once glorious face of England had become thin, hollow, and ghostly. The jewels that once glowed on her skin now hung loose against frail bones. And that famous white paint, the mask of eternity, had begun to crack. She was no longer the Virgin Queen. She was simply Elizabeth, human, mortal, and afraid. Her last words were quiet, barely more than breath. "All my possessions for one moment of time." A confession, a lament, a queen who had everything and nothing. On March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace, Elizabeth Tudor, the last of the Tudor dynasty, took her final breath. There was no husband to hold her hand, no child to inherit her crown, only silence, and the heavy scent of roses said to have filled the room the moment she died. They said her death mask was serene, as if she had finally found the peace she had chased all her life. For a woman who feared love, death became her only embrace. And yet, even in death, she remained a mystery. Her body was found covered with layers of powder, as if she wanted her mask to survive her one last time. When the coffin passed through London, tens of thousands stood in silence. No one spoke, no one dared. They watched the Virgin Queen leave her city one final time. And when she was lowered into the tomb, the echo of the choir filled the air with the words she had once lived by. "I have the heart and stomach of a king." But in truth, she had always been a prisoner of her own heart. For 4 centuries, the legend of the Virgin Queen has endured, a symbol of power, intelligence, and defiance. But beneath that legend lies a different truth, one of isolation, fear, and pain. She wore her virginity like armor because she knew love could destroy her. She ruled with brilliance because she knew emotion would make her weak. And in the end, she became the one thing she feared most, a ghost, trapped in her own myth. History remembers her as the Virgin Queen, but the truth was far more human. A woman scarred by her past, haunted by her bloodline, and condemned to die alone, not because she chose chastity, but because the world gave her no other choice. Centuries have passed since the Virgin Queen closed her eyes for the last time, but her image still stares back at us, proud, perfect, untouchable. She became the symbol of an age, the face of empire, the illusion of control. Yet behind that face lay a truth too fragile for history to write. The truth of a woman who built her crown from the ruins of her own heart. Elizabeth ruled for nearly half a century without ever sharing her bed, her throne, or her heart. To some, that was power. To others, tragedy. But maybe it was both. She learned early that love was a weapon, that a woman's desire could be twisted, used, or destroyed. So she turned her pain into sovereignty, her wounds into strength. The girl who was never allowed to be loved became a queen who needed no one. Every stage of her life was a mask. The child wore fear. The queen wore command. The woman wore silence. And though the mask grew heavier with every passing year, she never let it fall. Because if she did, the world would have seen not a goddess, but a broken, lonely human being. Maybe that's why her story still haunts us. Because beneath the gold and glory, Elizabeth's life was not about virginity, but about survival. She was not pure because she was holy. She was pure because she was hurt. Because every time she reached for love, the world reminded her of its cost. Her chastity was not a vow to God. It was a scar left by men. And yet, she endured. Long after kings fell, empires crumbled, and bloodlines ended, her legend remained. The woman who defied her world, who outlived her enemies, who turned her suffering into immortality. Elizabeth Tudor died alone, but her myth never did. Because sometimes the most powerful people in history are not those who found love, but those who learned to live without it. And so, 400 years later, the Virgin Queen still reigns, not in flesh, but in legend.